History as it happens, January 16th, 2024. China's real historians.
Nanking, the once proud capital of Chiang Kai-shek, now lies under the shadow of an uncertain fate.
With reports that the Red Armies, which bypassed the city, have cut the last remaining avenue of escape.
In Beiping, Mao Zedong inaugurates the so-called Chinese People's Republic.
There can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
Xi Jinping controls China's present, and now he controls its past. The first communist leader in more than 40 years to get a rewrite of China's modern history approved, and it's a glorious tale of achievement and a whitewash of the
This is the new reality for the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who now stands alongside Chairman Mao in the pantheon of the country's iconic leaders.
In China, the ruling Communist Party controls the past, or at least is trying to monopolize it. A brave number of ordinary citizens is challenging that monopoly by using basic technologies to publish the truth about Mao and the CCP's sordid record. Yes, China has a history war too. And that's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Yeah, it isn't just a sort of a nicety that they want to control the past. From their perspective, this is absolutely essential. And I think the key reason for that is the lesson they drew from the decline, the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in the way that Xi Jinping, he's talked about this publicly, the way he sees it is that Gorbachev took power and made a critical mistake.
If you've been paying any attention to American culture over, say, the last several decades, you're aware of our history wars. They have intensified in recent years. Conservative and liberal activists, professional historians, journalistic giants like the New York Times, podcast hosts, anyone with a stake in how the past is interpreted, and that would be everyone, has been fighting over the American story. And why is this? To see who scores the highest on a test? Well, no. It's because our origins matter. The truth matters. Who we, the people, were defines who we are today and where our future might be going. I talk about this stuff all the time, but usually in an American context, the so-called history wars. Well, they are raging in China too, and the most powerful force there is the Chinese Communist Party. It controls the textbooks, the history books, the internet. And the party now led by Xi Jinping draws its legitimacy from a false telling of history when it comes to the period covered in, say, this old newsreel narrated by Walter Cronkite, published by Periscope Film on YouTube.
May 25th, 1949. The communists, well prepared politically, take Shanghai without disorder. The new Kuomintang capital will be in Canton, and that too will soon fall in October. October 1st, 1949. In Beiping, Mao Zedong inaugurates the so-called Chinese People's Republic. Zhou Enlai, former peace negotiator, becomes premier.
In an essay titled Who Gets to Tell China's Story in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, journalist Ian Johnson writes, since the Mao era, the CCP has used myths to explain the recent past. The worst disaster in the history of the People's Republic was the Great Famine of 1959 to 61, which killed up to 45 million people, or about 20 times the number who died during the Cultural Revolution. Officially, however, what is called the 3 difficult years is reckoned to have killed only a few million people, and only because of natural disasters and the pullout of Soviet advisors. The party, in other words, is blameless. Johnson goes on to say, and yet this distorted view of history is dismissed by almost any important historian at home or abroad, not to mention the people who lived through it. They know the famine was due to Mao's delusional economic policies, which forced farmers to pursue fanciful agricultural and industrial strategies that destroyed years of harvests. Until recently, however, this discrepancy was not a significant problem for the party, Johnson writes, because it created only pockets of disconnect. Some people might know the party's version to be untrue, but most people would be aware only of the party's account. Now, what would be the equivalent in our country? Well, Americans have plenty of blind spots when it comes to our past. but not because our government is forcing us to read an approved version of it and jailing those who dissent. In China, some ordinary citizens are disgusted by the party line because, among other things, they know their rulers are using history to justify their desire to rule China forever. Ian Johnson's a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of Sparks, China's Underground Historians and Their Battle for the Future. He spent a total of close to 20 years reporting from China. Ian Johnson, hello.
Happy to be here.
Congrats on your thought-provoking essay in Foreign Affairs, Who Gets to Tell China's Story? And you state in the essay that the Chinese Communist Party's most important source of legitimacy is its myth-like telling of history. What did you mean by that?
Well, I guess it goes without saying, but it's still worth saying it maybe, that the Communist Party is not in power because it won an election. It is in power because it defeated the Kuomintang party in a civil war that ended in 1949, and so it took power. That's a historical fact, but it isn't that inspiring a story to sort of say, well, we won the Civil War and therefore we're in power and we're going to just stay in power indefinitely. We've been in power for now almost 75 years. It'll be the 75th anniversary in October. Never had an election, and we are only in power, and this is the official story, because we saved China. China was going down the tubes in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. We came to power and we put China back on its feet and on the road to prosperity. And because we're doing such a great job running China, we should be allowed to rule it indefinitely into the future. And of course, if you look at the history of China over the past 75 years, you realize there have been a lot of crises and debacles, but those are expunged from the historical record in China. And so the party's able to present this unblemished record. And that's what it uses to justify why it should stay in power.
All governments want to have ownership of history, or politicians, right? They use history to tell a narrative about the country, and therefore this is why we should support my policies on X, Y, and Z, right? But it seems that in China, it's not just about owning the past. It's, as you say, erasing the real past and creating a myth. You say that Xi Jinping, who's been the president since 2013, sees as a life and death struggle. The party must win at all costs. This competition over who gets to control the past. That's quite a statement.
Yeah, it isn't just a sort of a nicety that they want to control the past. From their perspective, this is absolutely essential. And I think the key reason for that is the lesson they drew from the decline, the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in the way that Xi Jinping, and he's talked about this publicly, the way he sees it is that Gorbachev took power and made a critical mistake. Gorbachev is probably known for two policies, glasnost and perestroika. And perestroika is economic reconstruction, and that would be okay from Xi Jinping's point of view. But glasnost, openness, that was the problem. And under Gorbachev, there were civil society organizations that went into and researched the history of the Soviet Union, especially the Stalin era. They literally dug up mass graves and wrote about this, made books and films about it. In Xi Jinping's mind, this undermined belief in the Soviet Union, so that people no longer thought the Soviet Union was legitimate. And Xi Jinping thought, that will not happen to us. We're not going to follow the same fate of the Soviet Union.
I think he's right about that, don't you?
Yeah, I think if people realized the debacles of the past 75 years, and not just stuff from the last century, like the Cultural Revolution or the Great Famine. I mean, that's bad enough. The Great Famine from 1958 to 61 is the worst famine in recorded history, with up to 45 million people dying. And it wasn't because of natural disasters or floods or drought, anything like that. It was policy driven. It was the delusional policies of Chairman Mao, whose picture is still adorning the Tiananmen Gate right in downtown Beijing. His mausoleum is right in the heart of the capital.
Yeah.
So,
well, Xi outlawed criticism of Mao, right? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, he outlawed criticism of Mao, and then outlawed criticism of the recent past, even up to, say, the COVID lockdowns and the the hardship that caused and the deaths that happened over the past year or so, all of that is taboo. So history isn't something just from last century. It goes up to yesterday, basically.
Not to go on a tangent about the Soviet Union, but it is important. Gorbachev came of age when Khrushchev denounced, or renounced, is that the right word, Stalin at one of the party congresses. And as you say, in the late 1980s, Gorbachev allowed a flowering of journalistic, artistic freedom. People could explore the past and be honest about it in public and criticize the party. So if communism is supposed to be promising you something, it tells a story of historical development. You're sacrificing like an SOB now because we're, on our way, the horizon, right? We can see the horizon coming. Once people have reason to no longer believe in that, well, then the whole thing falls apart, right? The legitimacy falls apart. As I always say on this podcast, autocracies, dictatorships do have to rely on public support differently than they do in democracies.
Yeah, it's not all based on guns and secret police. I mean, that certainly plays a role in China, but they have to do what political scientists call performance legitimacy. You legitimize yourself through performance. And, when the economy is growing really fast, like it used to grow in China in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, then you can kind of make a case that, hey, we may make mistakes or we made mistakes in the past, but we've been doing a pretty good job recently. Tomorrow's a better day, and so on and so forth. Now, I think with the economy slowing in China and all of these other problems arising, we're in a much harder time. And so the party has to really erase the recent past and create this myth-like story of how it's doing a great job.
Yeah, and your essay is about the underground historians who are getting the truth to people. We're going to get to them, but we started off on this beat, so we're going to stay with it just a little bit longer. This does square with Xi's mission to rejuvenate China. When he took power in 2013, his initial promise was to end corruption, right? Because the party was becoming unpopular with ordinary Chinese because of all the corruption. But the larger mission was to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. And he used the historical memory of China going back many, many centuries, right? But it's the ugly stuff post-1949 that he seems to be most concerned about in order to achieve what's called the Chinese dream. There can only be one ideological future in China, and that is Chinese socialism. So we can't have people understanding what Mao actually did in the 1950s. I mean, is that basically it?
Yeah, that's it. It's been one of his signature policies since taking power in 2012. He has emphasized this over and over again in his actions, in the measures that he's taken, the rhetoric that he's used. This is one of his key policies. And I think, as you were saying, dictators, they need popular support, and they also, in some ways, are similar to democratically elected politicians in that they have a limited amount of political capital. I mean, we sometimes imagine that people like Xi Jinping can do anything they want with a snap of their fingers, but they have a limited number of things they can do. They have priorities that they have to set, and this has been one of his priorities. So it shows that, at least in his mind, this is a really, really important issue.
Another Ian Kershaw, the great historian of the Third Reich, coined a term. I think he coined this. Popular dictatorship. At least it shows up in his books about Hitler and the Third Reich. Popular dictatorship. So who are these citizen historians, and how are they spreading the truth? Are they artists, educated intellectuals, or just ordinary folks, as you say, who have PDFs and small digital cameras?
Yeah, so these are the people who are fighting back against the party's monopoly on the past. They often are inspired by an event that they witnessed or that their family encountered. One of the people I write about is a journalist named Jiang Shi. She's this is also in my book that I wrote that sort of expands on this. Her family went through the Great Famine. Her grandfather sacrificed himself so that their family could live. So through that family history and that sort of inherited trauma of what they went through in the 1950s and 60s, she became a citizen journalist. Initially, she worked for state media, but then when that became impossible under Xi to do anything meaningful, she went off on her own and began to write write articles and books and make some films about the past to try to explore these issues and alert people to what happened.
So, what kind of content are they sharing? Content, a very modern, jargony term that journalists in the United States use. But what are they sharing? How are they sharing it?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, maybe just to get to your point of cameras and stuff, this is really all only possible because of simple digital technologies. Stuff we take for granted nowadays, but which 30 years ago didn't exist. And these are digital cameras, which allows anybody to make a documentary film. I mean, you can go with a very cheap handheld camera, even with your phone if you want, and you can make a film, you can cut it on your laptop. 30, 40 years ago, to make a film, you had to have a sophisticated editing suite and so on and so forth. It was a big process. Now anybody can make a film. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, as you said, PDFs. PDFs, again, we take it totally for granted. But if I want to share a book with you, in the past, I would have to give you a physical copy of it, or I maybe could make a photocopy of it. But in some ways, we'd have to meet, or I'd have to mail it to you or something like that. Now, almost all of these books that people are interested in, there are PDFs of them. Or you can at least scan a book if you want, or scan articles and so on, and I can just email it to you. And that radically changes how information is shared. What these things are, the content you asked, they're often accounts of the past. They tell the true story of what happened in the famine. They're sometimes oral histories by the person themselves. Others are more ambitious, like Jiang Shui, I mentioned, this independent journalist. She goes out and interviews people. Some of them elderly, some of them, again, talking about events of last century, some recently. She's done stuff on the COVID lockdowns. They share this information and try to give a truer accounting of the past than the party allows.
Now, you mentioned in your essay how historians are documenting the Great Leap Forward, which resulted in the famine, Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen Square. We're going to return to Tiananmen Square, how the U.S. responded to that. George Bush, the president at the time, had a news conference where he was reluctant to heavily crack down on China for what happened at Tiananmen Square. I guess at the time it was believed that China was moving in the right direction.
I don't want to see a total break in this relationship, and I will not encourage a total break in the relationship. This relationship is, when you see these kids struggling for democracy and freedom, this would be a bad time for the United States to withdraw and pull back and leave them to the devices of a leadership that might decide to crack down further. Some have suggested I take the ambassador out. In my view, that would be 180 degrees wrong. Our ambassador provides one of the best listening posts we have in China. He is thoroughly experienced, and so let others make proposals that, in my view, don't make much sense. I want to see us stay involved and continue to work for restraint and for human rights and for democracy. And then down the road, we have enormous commonality of interests with China, but it will not be the same under a brutal and repressive regime. So I stop short of suggesting that what we ought to do is break relations with China.
We'll get back to that. How is the regime cracking down on these PDFs and homemade documentary movies?
Well, there used to be an independent film festival in Beijing. That's been closed down. This was a way to share the information. In the 2000s, about 20 years ago, up to about, say, 15 years ago, there was a really open period in China, at least in the internet, relatively speaking. It was open, and bulletin board services, there were file sharing mechanisms that people could use to share the information. So the government has closed those things down. Some of the more prominent independent historians have been harassed. One guy I write about in my book, Hu Jie, who's made some just dynamite documentary films, he's now regularly harassed by the government. He's not in jail, but whenever he goes and tries to interview people, the government will call ahead of time. The Public Security Bureau will call ahead of time and say, hey, don't talk to this guy or you'll get in trouble. So they do things like that to make their life miserable. And I think really significantly, under Xi Jinping, they closed down the only official independent history journal. And this was a history journal that Xi Jinping's own father supported. Wow. His father was a liberal communist, might sound like an oxymoron, but there were members of the party who were similar to Gorbachev, let's say, who thought we needed an accounting of the past. And they had this journal called China Through the Ages. Xi Jinping in 2016 closed it down because he thought it was too much of a threat.
So it's safe to say that most Chinese are still being taught the official line about all these past debacles and tragedies. Is it possible to know how deeply these more accurate histories have penetrated Chinese society?
I think of course, it's really difficult because there are no such things as public opinion polls in China, or at least independent opinion polls. So it's hard to know. You can see, though, the importance of it in when there is a crisis in China. Let's say about a year and a half ago, there was a big crisis over the COVID lockdowns, and the censors had a hard time controlling social media because there was such a flood of criticism. At times like that, these independent historians appear much more regularly in social media because, again, the censors are having a hard time controlling it. I've noticed I started a website to put all of these independent historians' materials together. And this website is called the China Unofficial Archives. So it has books, magazines, movies, etc. And we've been getting a lot of feedback from inside China. Obviously, the site is blocked in China, but people in China, there are a significant number of people who use VPNs. These are called, virtual private networks. It allows you to jump over the firewall in China and go to the free internet, the one that is not censored. And they can get to sites like this and other sites. So I think it spreads, especially in times of crisis. If we posit that China is now entering a new era of slower economic growth, more social turmoil that we've seen over the past couple of years, that I think the demand for this will increase.
The people who produce this content, whether it's films or histories, they tend to be intellectuals, historians, filmmakers, activists, right? But they want to reach a general audience?
I mean, very few of them are trained, let's say, some of them are trained historians with PhDs. Almost none of them have been to film school. They're autodidactic. They've learned it on their own. They are often not that well educated. I remember talking to one guy, a self-educated person. He grew up in the Cultural Revolution. His education was interrupted, never went to college. And I kept asking him, why do you do it? Are you trying to do this? Are you trying to do that? And he says, I don't understand all this theory. I can't explain to you the theory of why I'm doing it. But what gets me really upset is the lack of righteousness in society. There's one thing, and he used the Chinese term zheng yi, which means righteousness, justice, which is, I think, a universal human belief that there should be some justice in society. So when I see this, I get really angry and I have to do something about it. And so, you get people like that who just essentially have a wild hair up their behind and just really, it ticks them off and they feel they have to do something.
So Communist China was established in 1949 after the Civil War. The 50s were a terrible decade under Mao. The origins of this citizen movement, as you've been discussing here, the citizen movement to take ownership of the real past in China, can be traced to a 1960s magazine called Spark. What was its significance and what is its current significance, this magazine?
Well, Spark could have been one of the many hopeless, quixotic efforts by people to challenge the CCP. A group of students were exiled. They got caught up in a political purge. They were exiled to the western reaches of China. They saw the Great Famine firsthand, and they thought they had to inform their fellow citizens about what was going on. They got a hold of a mimeograph machine, which is an older technology that some listeners may not be familiar with, but it allows you to essentially kind of make copies of something on a barrel-type printing press and print on paper. They wrote very trenchant essays that today are still relevant. They talked about the lack of freedom of expression. Don't forget, this is 1960. This is only 11 years after the People's Republic has been founded. They talked about the fact that farmers don't own their land and therefore they got caught up in this famine and were forced to do what the party wanted and so on and so forth. They were all arrested. 3 of them were executed. The rest were sent to labor camps, many up to 20 years, and it could have just died. All the copies were confiscated by the Public Security Bureau. But what happened in the 1980s, one of the members, who is now a middle-aged woman, she got a hold of her police file. And this is something that every Chinese person has a file that the government keeps on them. Just like the Stasi kept files on everybody in East Germany, there is a file, a Dangan, kept on everybody in China. She got a hold of hers, and inside her file were the issues of Spark. And also all the police records, everything, including love letters that her boyfriend had written to her. He was one of the people who was executed. She made photos of this. And then in the late 1990s, again, PDFs allow her to put the photos together into a PDF. They start circulating. It gathers speed very slowly, but eventually it creates a critical mass. People began to realize, aha, there were these people back in the 50s and 60s who faced the same issues that we're facing today: lack of freedom of expression, lack of ownership, lack of private property, et cetera, et cetera. So it became a touchstone for this counter history movement. Films were made about it, and people wrote books about it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why you can think of this as like the origin of this independent history movement.
And this independent history movement also reflects a change in the way activists, the citizen historians, whoever, think about historical memory in China. This is probably the most important observation in your essay, at least in my view. It's personified by Wang Xiaobo, who passed away in 1997. You say here that he had been shocked by the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre and questioned his own failure to support the protesters. But he came to believe, you write, that the protesters, as noble as they may have been, had represented an older way of doing things that he could no longer support. He believed the protests' core problem was that it fractured into groups that were too weak to oppose the overwhelming power of the one-party state. So he then started to write about these groups, these individuals, rather than writing about them as a privileged intellectual who is talking about, the big philosophical issues. A lot of these stories, if you will, if we want to call them that, or independent narratives, are about individual struggles.
Yeah, that's right. Wang Xiaobo was one of the most prominent novelists. He wrote a fantastic racy novel called Golden Age, which has been recently translated and published in English, and I commend that to readers who want to sort of a bit of a raunchy look at the Cultural Revolution, colorful and funny. And he wrote this essay called The Silent Majority. And he realized that if you think of it broadly, the majority of people in China, in some way or another, are kind of victims. The victims of communist oppression are not just dissidents and people like that we think of. There are many people like the farmers who don't own their land, the miners who have to work in unsafe labor conditions, the people in the sweatshops who don't have labor rights and things like that. When you add them all together, they make really a majority of people in society, and he called them the silent majority. He thought that it was much more effective than, rather than writing about abstract issues like freedom of speech or even parliamentary democracy or something like that, try to tell the stories of these people. And through that, you can see the root causes, and you can then understand what's going on in society much more effectively. That was his idea, and that was picked up, I think, by a lot of these citizen historians in the years that followed, especially with the advent of these simple digital technologies.
Now, you cite something that Michel Foucault, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, mentioned about how intellectuals had moved from pontificating on classic universal themes, freedom, morality, existence, to specific areas in which they possess specialized knowledge. For instance, somebody who is Chinese and suffering from HIV.
HIV spread really rapidly in China because of blood transfusions. There were whole villages of poor people in China who donated their blood for money. But these blood transfusion banks were not sanitary. And so when HIV got into them by one member, the needles and so on were not sterilized. And so entire villages got infected with HIV. This was exposed by a Chinese doctor who had the knowledge and the expertise to explain exactly what happened. And that person became a very well-known public figure in China. And so those are the kinds of people who are intervening in the public debate or in a crisis because they have specific knowledge, rather than somebody who writes a big petition, in favor of freedom of speech or something like that. You have people who say, hey, there's a problem in society and I can explain what happened and let's try to address it like that.
You were a journalist for many, many years in China. You mentioned from 1994 to 2001 and then from 2008 to 2020. So during Xi's rule, was it more difficult for you to do your job over time?
It was initially when I went to China. I went there, in fact, for the first time in the 1980s, and I was a student in 1984, 85 in Beijing, and I did my senior thesis, my bachelor's thesis on journalism in China, and I went and interviewed all the journalists. And, back then you couldn't leave Beijing without permission. When I got back to Beijing in the 1990s, there was still that rule that you couldn't leave Beijing without permission, but it was never really enforced. And so there was a golden age for foreign correspondents in the late 90s and early 2000s when you could travel widely around China. Foreigners were not viewed suspiciously as many times as they often are now in China. Journalists were not, unless you were really interviewing dissidents all the time, you weren't really followed as a foreign correspondent. You could take a plane or a train, and later in the 2000s and early 2010s, I rented a car, could drive around China and talk to people in the street, just man on the street interviews. That was all possible. But when she took power, the pendulum was already swinging in the other direction. It became increasingly impossible to get interviews with government officials, and even to do interviews with people got harder and harder. People got nervous. They began to think, if I talk to this foreign correspondent, I'm going to maybe get in trouble. You could understand where they were coming from also, because they might get in trouble. In the past, you never really had to worry about anonymizing people, but after a while, you began to think, maybe I better not use this person's name because it could get them in trouble. So it got harder and harder. And from what I understand from my friends and colleagues who are there now, it's really tough to travel and do any interviews.
Well, the regime has taken a hit in its legitimacy because of COVID, as you mentioned before. So
yeah, for sure.
They're in no mood to allow people to speak their minds.
It's really worried, and there are all these campaigns against espionage, and people are being bombarded with television ads and posters saying, foreigners are spies and things like that, which, obviously there probably are some spies in China, but I doubt they are the kind of spies that they think, some foreigner walking around with dark glasses on and a slouch hat going, hey, I want you to sell secrets to me.
Yeah, I often wonder if ordinary people just roll their eyes when they hear government propaganda after a while, that they realize that they're being lied to. I should have asked you earlier, how do ordinary people react when they learn the truth of, say, the Great Leap Forward or Tiananmen Square, to cite a more recent example?
It causes a questioning. And again, I think in the past, let's say 20 years ago, when China was growing 10% a year and the economy was doubling roughly every 7 or 8 years, that papered over a lot of cracks in society. And you might say, yeah, I don't like those SOBs at the top, but tomorrow's a better day. My kid can go to college. We can buy our home. I can travel abroad on a package tour to Thailand or Europe or the United States or something like that. So even though I don't really like the government, I'm going to hold my nose and just go with the flow. Nowadays, you see people who are much less likely to do that because the economy is not growing at 10%. It's growing officially at 5%, but the real growth is probably a lot lower than that. And there are obvious signs of problems in the way the government is running the country. The COVID lockdowns is one example, but people can't help but notice that last year, for example, the foreign minister just disappeared. The defense minister was arrested or thrown in jail. We don't know. He's disappeared from view. The head of the elite rocket force in the military, the 2 top generals, they just disappeared. People are like, what's going on in the government? There's clearly purges or something going on. It no longer seems like a meritocratic government doing a great job.
Well, our own defense secretary here.
Yes,
is in the hospital.
I was just
we're-
thinking of that when I
Oh,
said
yeah,
that.
no.
Actually. Oops, I have to go in for surgery. Gee, you might let the president know, right? Anyway.
Final issue here. I mentioned George H.W. Bush before. The idea was that China was moving in the right direction. It was opening up its economy and that political liberalization would follow. Bill Clinton made similar kind of arguments in the 90s when he worked hard to get China into the World Trade Organization.
Bringing China into the WTO is a win-win decision. It will protect our prosperity, and it will promote the right kind of change in China.
When you think back to your own thinking from those days, late 80s, early 90s, did you also believe that China might be on its way to a liberal democracy? Maybe not like ours, but at least, multiple party system. Or did you believe it was excessively optimistic to think that China would develop the way, say, Eastern Europe did after the Cold War?
I think I realized that the Communist Party had more resiliency than the communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe because they got the economy right. And I think that was the one thing that the Soviet Union never did. The Soviet Union never had a vibrant economy. However, I was more optimistic. I wrote a book in 2004 called Wild Grass, which was about people who were challenging the party in the legal sphere, farmers and so on. I didn't think that China would democratize, but I kind of believed in this idea called the modernization theory, which is that as countries get more prosperous and better educated, you have more people in society who are stakeholders, who have something to lose. They're homeowners, property owners, for example, educated people, and they will push the government for a bigger say in how the country is run. And I thought something like that would happen slowly. I think China's like a supertanker, but I thought it would slowly begin to turn in that direction. But that has not happened. And I think what I failed to anticipate is the stubbornness in wanting to crack down, and that they would, rather than accommodating these forces in society, which still exist, but rather than accommodating them, they've just cracked down on them.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what Xi Jinping represents. I think Xi Jinping, sometimes we overemphasize the individual. I think he represents a trend in the party to do that. And that was probably already apparent in the late 2000s. I think by the end of the Summer Olympics in 2008, it was clear which way the government was going. And Xi Jinping had already been appointed, but because we already knew in 2007 that he was going to take over in 2012, but he sort of represents, and because he's a more powerful, forceful leader, he's just really attracted a lot more attention. But the party was already turning against an open society by that point. And that's the tragedy of contemporary Chinese history. There was no Gorbachev. There was nobody who was willing to experiment.
And as you said at the top of our conversation, the way things went for the Soviet Union left an impression on the Chinese. The first semi-free election under Gorbachev during the late days of the Soviet Union, although at this point, I should be clear, it wasn't obvious that the whole thing was going to disappear in a couple of years. But that first semi-free election where you had multiple people competing for, say, a single seat in the parliament, they were all communists, but you still had a choice. And,
right.
The Chinese Communist Party could maintain its monopoly on power, but you at least could have competitive elections. You have just different kinds of Chinese socialists, but we're not even there.
Yeah, there were experiments in that in the 1990s in village elections.
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
China has roughly about 800,000, 900,000 villages.
Wow.
And they would allow, say they would have a committee of like 3 or 5 people, I can't remember. And then they would allow, say there were 5 people in the committee, they would allow 7 candidates. And if there were non-party members who won, the Communist Party would then go and recruit them and say, join the party because you won the election. We want you in the party. They allowed that as a safety valve against super corrupt, tyrannical heads of villages. And they even allowed it the next step up the food chain in the prefectural level. This is what happened in Taiwan. First, Taiwan had village elections, then they had county elections, and then they had nationwide elections. And there was this hope in the 1990s that this might happen in China too. But these elections were then basically, that experiment ended in the 2000s.
Because it went too well?
I think they just thought it's a Pandora's box.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Used to voting in local elections, they're going to say, well, I can vote for my village chief. Why can't I vote for the national chief, So I think that was just a bad precedent to set. So they still have these rubber stamp elections and stuff like that, but it doesn't mean anything.
Today, we do not seek to impose our vision on others, but we are convinced that certain rights are universal. Not American rights or European rights or rights for developed nations, but the birthrights of people everywhere, now enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. The right to be treated with dignity, the right to express one's opinions, to choose one's own leaders, to associate freely with others, and to worship or not freely, however one chooses.
House President Bill Clinton, 1998, his speech on China and human rights. And in an upcoming episode of this podcast, we're going to stay in this region of the world. Speaking of human rights, voting rights, I'll be dedicating an episode about the elections in Taiwan and China's reaction. But on the next episode of History as It Happens, who are the Houthis? And how is what's happening in the Red Sea right now going to affect geopolitics in the greater Middle East? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.